The title's already making me think of
How bad we are at finishing projects.
But we are an unfinished project,
Mostly
and we
that
should finish this project.
mostly that Melville was attempting to create an authentically American genre, and what he meant by that was capturing the democratic spirit of America, all these immigrants coming over with all their particular ways of going about the world, and he basically quit in that
The
project.
ship is America.
The ship is America. Yeah, kind of, a little bit.
Is it sinking?
Did sink in the end.
Yeah, but Melville quit halfway through trying to craft the authentic American genre in the writing, while writing Moby Dick.
He quit that goal halfway through.
Yeah. And in my eyes, maybe he actually succeeded in failing. Or that if you're going to craft an authentically American genre, if you're going to try to craft a democratic spirit, the democratic spirit of America, all the innumerable cultures and stuff that make up the country, then you have to fail because there's no way you're going to actually capture all of those different types of people. And even if you did, it would suck if you took into account every single type of person in America today and captured them accurately in a book. How long would that book be, and how tiring of a read would it be? But does anyone want to start this one?
I always love reading, but since Joby is here and Joby has already been nominated to read
By the committee?
by
The invisible
the
committee?
Invisible Committee.
Oh, okay, let me open up the PDF.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a dry joke, but Fred said that
Yeah.
the two of us have read too much, and other people listening to these soliloquies or whatever we want to call it
I love that new
will will possibly get sick of our voices. So we wanted the sweet and dulcet tones of you.
Yeah. That's basically it, yeah.
Sure, let me open up the PDF.
That was from Shakespeare, that. Since once I sat upon a promontory and heard a mermaid upon a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music amid Summer Night's Dream, Act 2, Scene 1.
So what page are we on?
117.
Nice. Oh, the unfinished. Nice. Okay. The unfinished. If Leibniz's account of substantiation, realization, provides such an adequate procedural account of art, this is because it is untainted by the classical production/reception dichotomy. The construction of a scientific fact, the effective presence of Christ, or the ceasefire between warring parties, all raise the question of how we are involved in their modes of existence. In the mutual reference between modes, harmony is not a given. Sorial mentions the parallelism of Spinoza's attributes as an example of a pre-established agreement, nor an emergence that is totalizing or exhaustive. Rather, it remains multiplicitous. Subjects and objects become moments in nebulous occasions of experience in which we must settle for a sort of harmony, a sort of sufficient analogy, a sort of evident and stable reflection in the work made of what the work to be made was. In the end, this sufficient proximity defines the completion. Not to stop after a single paragraph, but is what is being talked about here the idea that there are multiple different seemingly unrelated fields. For example, the existence of Christ or the construction of scientific facts, but they all demand that we have an opinion on them, or at least that we, even if we don't have an opinion, are already involved in their modes of existence. And this kind of emergence of the same feeling in art is also like just as constructed.
Are you referencing that line, in the mutual reference between modes, harmony is not a given nor an emergence that is totalizing or exhaustive?
Sort of, yeah.
rather it remains multiplicitous. That reminds me of what you were saying about data, how data is multiplicative at its inception. If it's multiplicative, then it might not be harmonious. It's not like there's one given interpretation, but a multiplicity of interpretations.
I'm comparing this to how museums show art and they have to invent a category and then go and find all these already made pieces of artwork that might mean something completely different, but they put it under the umbrella of a certain category. Oh, all these art pieces were made by women or something. And then it kind of flattens the affect because somebody goes to the museum and they're going to look at all these art pieces a certain way. But I guess the final sentence where it says this sufficient proximity defines the completion.
How you connect things in Obsidian.
That's quite nice. That's a nice way of putting it.
And there's an interesting thing at the start there where it's Leibniz's account of substantiation, realization. It provides an adequate procedural account of art.
What is that? I don't know what that is. This Leibniz's account of substance. Are they referring to something specific here?
Not as such. It's about the procedural, technical creation of an art object, or as he goes on, construction of a scientific fact. So I was just going to touch on this because it makes me think of there's like a kind of mathematical underpinning to the creation, and then there are technological underpinnings to the creation, like it was only possible because of these other things. And actually, this whole little paragraph, it makes you think of systems theory, of all these interconnected, all these disjoined, but systems that come into play with each other for the creation of the thing.
Personally, I'm not much of a Leibniz philosopher. With Leibniz, the little I know about him is that he had a conception of God that, like a lot of other philosophers' conceptions, is omniscient and omnipresent. So he's everywhere and he knows everything. And that all human beings are known for all time and are like directly chosen by God to exist. However, for Leibniz, this caused more problems than it solved because he didn't want to deny the existence of free will. However, his God demanded a kind of determinism in order to operate. And so Leibniz tried to get around this by talking about something he called substantiation, which I'm really hazy on, to be honest. But substantiation was just a fancy word for Leibniz to say there are many ways in which something might be decided in advance, but those ways are complicated, truth is complicated. And then he goes on and makes some claims and distinctions about the essence of truth, and he gets complicated in that way. But that's the simplest way I can explain substantiation without knowing anything about it, to be honest. I can go ahead and continue if you'd like, guys.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorial describes instauration as a drama of presence with at least 3 characters, each with their own existential claim, poignancy, and duration. The actual material, the virtual work to be made, and the artist who hears the appeal of the work to be made. The accomplishment of a work is defined by the progressive invention of a coinciding double modality in the unity of a single being. That is, the moment when the physical reality of the material thing meets the spiritual reality of the work to be made, such that one mode of existence is the lucid mirror of the other. The problem is, of course, that instead of a question of faithful imitation, this mirroring is distorted by intermittent experiences. The late is the new. Only the copy can cause the original to exist. This primacy of practice is the reason why perfection is a matter of degree, but not of analogy. There is no ideal existence, for it is not the idea but its reality that is in question. For it, perfection is not a matter of a simple harmonic correspondence of each being with itself, such that it is either fully present or else deficient across those various planes. We must realize, rather, that there are not only correspondences, echoes, but also actions and events through which these correspondences are made or unmade, are intensified as in the resonance of a harmony with many parts, or are undone and unmade. In other words, the realization of a work is not a creation out of nothing, but a vibratory event, a mutual approach, or reciprocal use, branchment, abouchement, of the three modes of matter: what, idea, why, and artist, who, in a surextensual mode of substantial union. How? Oh, the 5 W's, baby. Matter and idea meet in the manner in which the soul of the artist, traditionally also the art critic, and more recently the spectator participant, responds to them. But the emergent process is not defined exclusively in relation to this involvement. It is certainly the case that some things only exist due to a maker. Nevertheless, the soul is merely the locus of the idea, not in the mode of its owner, but in the manner of a vertiginous sensation of the material itself. The potter possesses the clay no less than she is possessed by it. This raises the question of what Sorial calls the work of spiritual completion. How do we pass from thing-like, raic mode of existence to an aesthetic mode of existence?
Vertiginous means dizzying, if you know the vertigo.
Vertigo, right? Instauration for Sorial is, in terms of like artwork, it's like three things. It's Indesigno and the artist themselves, but the accomplishment of a work can only take place within the artist. That's why he says double modality in the unity of a single being. Because within the artist themselves, they have the idea of the artwork and the will to make that art.
It's interesting that you said instauration is three things, and going back to the chapter on design, because up until now I was basically reading instauration as like a synonym for renewal, considering Sajord's discussion in our group discussion on how Mannerism concerns itself with a repotentializing. But now I think I have to go back and actually think about what instauration means again.
I think of it as bringing into being.
I think you're both correct in a certain point, but I think Jay's maybe closer. But what's interesting about this paragraph is the first line on that new page. The problem is, of course, that instead of a question of faithful imitation, this mirroring is distorted by intermittent experiences. The late is the new. Only the copy can cause the original to exist. If it were just renewal, then with this description we've just read, the very first thing is like a kind of renewal. If you complete a collage you make for the first time, and it's like the first save of it and you're done with it. Renewal in this sense is during the process of making that collage, you're continually updating your ideas about what you want to do, and it's driven by the process of just doing it. You don't know exactly where you're going to end up when you do a collage, but you have some ideas in your head.
If we're thinking about the New Age Catholics, a lot of old school Catholics would look at those new Catholics and go, I really don't understand why all these younger Catholics are watching anime and making Christian anime memes on Instagram. But
then the church come out with Luca.
Yeah, and then the church comes out with Luca. But if the church never came out with Luca, then Catholicism would just remain in this dead and stagnant tradition. So there's a distorted recharging in the church coming out with Luca.
The Catholic Church is a machine for absorbing art and spitting it back out. It's quite incredible.
Only the copy, Luca, can cause the original Miku to exist.
I've already written on the server how I think Luce is a mannerist construction. It's how a meme travels mimetically.
I'm stuck on that idea of how memes transfer mimetically. That is basically how memes continue to exist and continue to take on new life, like the meme of the South Korean woman. Previously, it was to showcase how ridiculous an idea was, like a meme of the South Korean woman, and it might have a caption like not South Korean, North Korean, the North Korean woman that rejected, and it might have the meme of the North Korean woman, and it says, in North Korea, they force us to get out and push the trains. And then later on, there was a reversal in that meme to where it no longer meant someone who was bullshitting, but someone that was telling the truth. And then you'd have memes of the North Korean woman, and she'd maybe go,
In the United States, they don't have trains.
yeah, exactly, perfect. They don't have trains. You're forced to purchase a,
$40,000 automobile.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I get you. I think I won't get too much into it because it's a little bit separate from the Mannerism text, but I'm always interested in the idea that mimetic exposure is like a linguistic virus in the sense that we, as social creatures, we're perceptive to group signaling and in-jokes, and we want to recognize certain patterns of behavior and things like that. And so I think memes are like a very good vehicle to transmit whatever. It's almost like the information is secondary. It's the format that's primary because the format elicits certain kinds of archetypal relations that are just easy to plug into. And so it really doesn't matter what the information is because you can see some memes where it's very clearly, sorry, I've drawn myself as the Chad and you as a Sawyer. And I'm like, yeah, but the opinion's still bullshit. But irregardless, it's interesting to see how some of these functions, like, they don't have to create anything new. They just have to sublimate themselves into already existing systems.
Even that
That
Chad
makes
Sojak
me
one
immediately-
is a reordering of Soviet propaganda.
And William Burroughs saying language is a virus from outer space.
In a sense, I always bring this back to Chomsky, but I really fuck with Chomsky when he says none of us speak the same language. But the idea that all of our languages are actually separate plays into the idea of it being a virus or some kind of virology where we've all got our own sort of unique biosphere. The gut bacteria in me is breaking down macroplastics your gut bacteria could never handle type beat. Which again just reminds me of genomic data in general, how all of us have a different genome, different chromosomes, and how the Human Genome Project could only really attempt to make a chimera and not like the perfect individual. But I digress a little bit.
Joby, do you know about chimera cells?
Not quite aware.
Chimera cells are the cells that a baby has. They're cells that are transferred from the mother in birth to the baby. I don't really remember much on it, but they're neat.
Interesting. What's with the images, Jay?
Who are these artists?
The very first one, I was really obsessed with the ruin in painting. And if you Google it or search it online, basically what you get is people talking about the Romantic period when ruins came into art. Basically, there's two different traditions from the two Gospels, one from Matthew and one from Luke, one where Jesus is born with the shepherds, and the other one, there's two art traditions that go with the Gospels, and one is Jesus born in a cave, and the other one, Jesus born in a manger with all the animals. And in the Eastern Church, it's always the cave. And then in the Western of the Roman Empire, it's the ruined building. And the ruined building is symbolic of, it's not a ruined building, but it's an unfinished or started or incomplete building that's in the process of being built. I went down this huge rabbit hole trying to find the very first painting that depicts a ruin. And I have some other things I want to read on the server about ruins and art. But if you see this last one I've just posted, it's a guy called Gentile di Fabriano, The Adoration of the Magi in 1423. And if you have a look over to the left, you'll see this very particular unfinished building, and it has a little bit of a brown thatched roof. And if you just look at that tiny little unfinished arch coming out, and then if you go up how many paintings to the wood or the etching blocks is Albrecht Dürer around 1500, and the rest during the flight to Egypt, you'll see that same little unfinished block in the top left. And if you look at the one above, you'll see the unfinished building above again, that same. The buildings and the themes travel mimetically across. So further up, you've got one where it's the pure building, the manger, where the cow's looking through the bars. Then when you go down, you've got one there where it is the two things combined together. You've got a building inside a cave. So the two memes cross over and collide in the middle with that. It was just looking at how this one particular unfinished building shape with the arch traveled through all of these paintings. But it is a mimetic transfer of that thing.
Is the first one Robert Campin?
The first one is probably Robert Campin, and I think he was working in the Low Countries.
And then the second one is The Adoration of the Magi.
Yes, that's Albrecht Dürer.
And then the third one is a Dirk Bouts painting.
Dirk Bouts, yeah. They're not particularly in chronological order. There's one more and just show you something really fascinating in the art. And if you see here, it's two different scenes. One is the Annunciation at the right, and you'll see the building style, the architectural style is Gothic. Gothic was seen as the style of the Christian church, of the completed Christian church in a way. And then in the background is the Romanesque architecture, and it shows, I think it's an Old Testament scene. And then in between, you've got the unfinished building, like the church is not complete yet, but Mary being pregnant with child there in the front, it shows you the beginning of the Christian church. So the building's styles were symbolic of the Romanesque was the old and Gothic was the new, was the Christian church. They clearly saw that in their iconography. The late is the new.
What's interesting as well is I know you have your threefold movement of however it goes and it ends in the Gothic. I think what's interesting about that is when people get sick of the Gothic and they crave for something new or whatever and a new form comes in, I don't think that the next thing that they do that is original and not just like a Gothic version of the previous movement, I wonder if that counts as being new. I know it sounds silly, but I guess when considering your threefold, the late is the new would only really apply to like step 2 and 3, right? As opposed to step 1.
We always start in the middle, and the new step 1 makes use of the previous technology and building, the technological advancements that the Gothic was made possible by the building advancements of the Romanesque. In my threefold, I would see the Romanesque as the primitive first, and you have the Gothic being as 3 parts to the Gothic. It's too convoluted, but the new movement is like that return, that Dionysian thing, the quote that Brad posted earlier, where it's completely making use of all the technological achievements and it stands on the shoulders of the thing before. It's a return, but it's detached from the final thing that it is departing from.
That happens in culture too, not just in like architecture or cultural byproducts,
and,
like
and language.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah, like what I was gonna say, because like anything is a cultural byproduct, so like language, architecture, art, all these things. But from an anthropological point, what you're talking about happens with people too. So think about Egypt. Egypt was like a band of like nomadic pastoralists that ended up forming a death cult, and then they formed bureaucracies because they wanted to keep track of whether or not their past loved ones were fed. And in doing so, they ended up establishing a large civilization over several thousand years. And then we get the establishment of the Old Kingdom underneath this big push of paternalism, where everyone was like equal before the father figure, this person who was like making sure everyone's dead got fed. And when the Old Kingdom fell because of rising inequalities, the intermediary period, it wasn't that like these things disappeared, but we talk about it like that and we treat it like this, it's like a dark age, that it was this period of nothing. But the reality is it was this heterodoxy. So this threefold approach you guys have been talking about can even really be boiled down to that Nietzschean discussion of basically the overman, heterodoxy versus orthodoxy, and that as an orthodoxy starts to strangle everything and create this slave mentality, then a new series of heterodoxy arise to break it apart. And then those will start coalescing again, and then again another series of heterodoxy will arise to help break it apart. But from an anthropological level, this occurrence on these massive societal-wide and cultural-wide levels, entire regions swept up in these movements, it starts at the family. And then this spreads. So society is propelled not by these impersonal structures. The impersonal structures are responding to things that arise from the family. Brett and I were talking about this on here a few weeks ago about bureaucratization and specialization. All this stuff arose from the family. It didn't just pop up because of the ways in which the machinations of society were grinding forward. No, society has always responded to what's been occurring at the familial level. There is no individual level. We like to think there is because we understand things with a monism, or we like to think that an individual acts are their acts alone. But the reality is we're not sole actors. We don't exist in a vacuum.
We also had this conversation too, like about if a person was raised in a tank, like without parents, then it wouldn't be a human. Because what makes you human is that you are raised by other humans.
Yeah, there's that girl. Was it Jeannie?
A feral child, right?
Yeah, the girl who was basically kept
That's
in a
it.
room and she was never spoken to. So she was still a human because the moment she was allowed to be around other people, she already wanted to connect. So the hard wiring is there. We are all fundamentally human, but to flesh it out and to be able to have it like be created in a meaningful way that won't just forever be stunted, we have to interact. So it's like a yes and not an either or. So if somebody is secluded in something their entire life, they are still human. They're just autistic in that way that Deleuze and Guattari used to talk about it. That separated way, that atomistic way. But we're not meant to be that on a fundamental biological or genetic level because Jeannie very quickly learned all kinds of things, and she could communicate, but she never learned grammar. She could point at cards, she could say certain phrases to get more information, and she devoured knowledge. We are humans regardless of whether or not we want to be them. We're not blank slates. Chomsky was wrong in a sense too, because his whole idea was that there's these built-in structures and there's only so many of them. It's very materialist, and yeah, material conditions are what they are, and there are only so many things. But the problem is, just like Jeannie causes this problem again, because even if she couldn't develop that grammar, she still understood what people were saying to her, and other people still understood her. So Chomsky doesn't even come back in. He doesn't even rise from the ashes like a phoenix. He's still in the scrap bin of history because it's still bullshit. If anything, we're intermediaries for something larger.
This does remind me of an anecdote that I'm pretty sure I remember from La Chinoise, the Godard film, that there's an anecdote about ancient Egypt where they were arguing about the nature of language acquisition. And there were some philosophers in the court of a pharaoh, and they were arguing Egyptian is the language of the gods. This is why everyone, when they're born, speaks Egyptian. And obviously there are other people who don't speak our language, but they're not the chosen ones. And we'll prove this by taking some Egyptian babies and we'll put them far away from civilization. And when we go find them again in 10 years after they've been fed but not interacted with, they're going to be speaking Egyptian, we promise you. And so they go and get 5 or so babies. They put them in a manger a mile away from Thebes, and they make sure the babies are fed and looked after for 10 years, but they never get spoken to, never interacted with. And in 10 years' time, when the philosophers go and collect the children, they were surprised because on their way to the manger, they could only hear goats bleating, but there were no goats nearby. And when they encountered the manger, they find the children are just bleating to one another because all they could hear were animals for 10 years.
I know this is an anecdote, but I bet those kids knew what each other was saying. Pidgin languages like that form. It's wild. We're left alone and we find ways to connect even when there are none established. And I had to read this book for this class I'm in. It's actually a pretty decent book, and it breaks down a lot of the imperialist story structures that we've come to all know and largely love, because who doesn't love seeing like 2-3 page long descriptions of the environment prior to learning a plot point? Sometimes it's good, but that's an imperialist structure, and it was imposed because indigenous storytelling was considered too blunt. Anyway, point is, this book, it's called Gun Island. It's pretty good, and in it there's this meta reflection between the story. Like, there's this guy, he's a book dealer, and he always likes these folklore stories, and he did his dissertation on the story of the merchant in Bengali folklore. And anyway, throughout this whole book, they basically have this big meta journey between the story of the gun merchant and the story of the characters who are in the present day. And throughout this, there's this continued reflection on being and becoming, because so much of this story is being driven by these poisonous creatures, and the story of the gun merchant relies on these two, because the deity who's involved is Bengali stuff, so there's like always a deity. And like Indian stuff, there's always deities causing nonsense because they want to be elevated in their poise towards godhood. But the point is, in all of this pushing, there's these discussions of people who only would speak a certain language ending up in Venice. How would a Bengali traveler survive in Venice in the 1500s, 1400s? And the whole point that the book's getting at with its subtext and its larger overarching narrative is that this globalism that we like to think is new isn't, and that we've always found ways of getting through and connecting, and that the world has only actually gotten larger instead of smaller. Globalism is nothing new. I talked about before too with Brett about the whole Hopewell interaction zone and the whole way that people have coalesced over millennia. Is wild how there's something going on deeper And we're drawn to these types of connections. And we were talking about Jay and Brad, like when we were having the discussions, like the question of the day, like the through line is personhood. And this whole notion of, is the mannerism in the room with you now? Yes. We're not sequestered in the ways that a lot of the conspiratorial thinking from like the 60s till now has been arguing. And we're not limited to the paternalistic atomism, object-oriented ontologies when they're flat notions would have. We're starting to get into that thing that I talked about a lot in Exy, that I was forming the smudgy ontologies. We're starting to recognize these boundaries are blurred, and while there is some influence between the layers, they're still largely just doing their own thing. So in this transference, the passing of the cells, those cells are real, and they pass not only from mother to child, but from child to mother. My wife has been irrevocably changed on a cellular level after having her kid. We've only had one kid. So if a mom ends up having 3 kids, 4 kids, then she's fundamentally changed into 5 different people. She contains a multitude. And we don't think about how this would change a person. We don't think about how this would contribute to their reactions to the world.
This all the time in really unfortunate divorces where people get divorced shortly after having kids because their husbands are often like, you've changed.
And
No
it's
shit,
like,
I've
yes,
changed.
of course she's changed. She's more than a person now. And I'm starting to really think that these fuzzy boundaries, these fuzzy ontologies, these smudgy ones, they exist regardless of what we think. So instead of one or several wolves, it's one wolf and several wolves. We're sticking with the Deleuze and Guattari notion. So it's not either or like they used to talk about, and it's not just flipped on its head. We can recognize the wolf and we can recognize the wolves, and we can see these stratum and we can see this array that it might be. And if we're able to find the through path, that personhood and the way it connects, we can release so much pain, so much suffering. It's almost a notion of enlightenment, but instead of enlightenment being this incredibly hard thing that people have to purposely strive for, the internet's made everyone enlightened the moment they touched it. I really think all this bad shit that's happening in my country right now, oh my God, it's a fucking joke. This shit that's coming with the Trump presidency here in a month, it's just absurd. But at the same time, it's going to lift all of us up because so much is going to break in a way where people are not going to be able to rely on anything except the images, the spectacle. And I don't know if the spectacle's as confining as I used to think, or as Baudrillard alluded to and what Debord ended up drinking himself to death over. I think there is an escape, and I think we're going to see a massive turn soon. Accelerations are right. They were right. We're at a point where all of our technology has outpaced us, but not to a degree where it's going to replace us. It's just exploiting all of our weaknesses. It wasn't like that in the 80s. It wasn't like that in the 90s. It wasn't even like that in 2010. But now it is. And all these things that are coming, like AI, just started to get introduced on a big, wide public scale 3 years ago.
It's only gonna get faster as well. The US have set up a department for AGI.
So all of these things, it happens exponentially. And what Jay was talking about, how there's those threefold things, it's happening too. And we're in that fall of the thing, and we're in the rebuilding stage. We're in the introduction of the heterodoxy. I saw one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. They're trying to remove the legal constraints on raw milk in the US. They're going to start trying to promote people being able to get raw milk.
This is partly insane, but if you live in New Zealand and you live on a dairy farm, you just take a couple of liters of what you've milked in the morning to the house, and that's what you drink. But that doesn't mean that everyone should
On an industrial scale.
It needs to be pasteurized.
I also saw that bird flu was making a jump into people more. There's been 1,000 cases in the US, and 50% of the people who've had it have died.
The CDC said that we should prepare ourselves for a virus worse than COVID that she hopes doesn't come about, but that it probably will come about.
I'm not particularly conspiratorial about those things usually, because that's somewhat true.
It's not even a conspiratorial thought. It's just based on statistics and data. This happens every so often. And when you have a mindset that promotes this whole notion of, I'm part of the heterodoxy and I'm part of the resistance, and then your resistance is catching bird flu because you didn't think about it. But at the same time, you can't argue against these people. And I saw this whole thing in response to this raw milk thing this morning. There were people openly cheering it on, saying, good, now these Republicans will all fucking die. And then other people were like, it's not going to be limited to these Republicans. And all I could think about was schismogenesis and how we're reaching the point where this is going to turn into violence.
So we got 4 pages left of this chapter. We've only
Yeah.
read 2 pages in, but do y'all want to bang out 2
Sure.
pages each and then
Were we on page 126?
we're on page 129 in the Finder or 118 in the
119.
actual book? Usually, instauration.
Usually, instauration is a matter of habit. While it does not have a mode of existence itself, habit institutionalizes the modes while simultaneously hiding itself. For this reason, Latour quips that it is not being essence that we have forgotten, but beings practices. Due to its self-generalizing character, habit is the mode of existence of essence. In hiding itself, it also hides the virtualities, what James calls prepositions, that it actualizes and preserves. Essences are effectively continuities that appear to be durable and stable because breaks in continuity are omitted even though they remain highlightable and retrievable at every moment. Mannerism, by contrast, is the re-dramatization of essence, which reveals the difference between substance, the habitual forgetting of discontinuities that constitutes being as being, and subsistence, the repetition through alterity that constitutes being as other. Essential to mannerism is therefore a certain intensity, a tremor of the things themselves that articulates as unease of the soul. Habits do not deceive in the sense of hiding something underneath appearances, but in the sense that the virtual is always more and ahead of the given. In bringing in pre-artistic and non-artistic materials and technologies that normally remain implicit, mannerism reveals that what appears to be a stable design is still an assemblage, functioning smoothly at other times in fits and starts, of multitudinous agencies and discontinuous associations. Whereas classicism relies on habit to both stabilize and cover over the difference between form and matter, mannerism confronts us with a double expression of manner and matter, as when we do several things at once. Sometimes formal manners endure for themselves, like gestures disconnected from the organicity of bodies. Diderot describes Jeu de l'auteur as the machinist of painting, as his work contains too much hand and too little idea, giving us only cold, mannequin-like portraits. Sometimes, by contrast, a material thickness asserts itself. Michelangelo dreamed of extracting from the alpine and living stone of a Carrara mountain top the giant that is hermetically confined in it. A dream that cannot but remain stuck between stone and form, as we also see in Giovanni de Bologna's Apennine Colossus, 1580. Either way, the immediate correspondence between the passages and leaps of an artistic practice and the extended material network through which they pass is lost.
Without a doubt, such a hyper-mediatic redoubling of manner and matter also occasioned the 16th century genre of the paragone. Which medium expresses a figure best, painting or sculpture? As a reminder of the non-identity of matter and form, mannerism does not convey the memory of something foundational, an ideal or model, but a crisis of content and the practical necessity for new and diverse modes of instauration. As Bergson anticipates Sorial, to picture is not to remember, since recollection is already a participation in this memorial ground or past that is contemporaneous with the present it has been, and that can always emancipate itself like a mirror image that turns the present itself into a moving mirror of the past. And as Deleuze concludes, the problem of art, the correlative problem of creation, is a problem of perception and not memory. on the condition that we must understand perception itself to be first of all a matter of a participatory presence, as with Bergson's attentive perception, and not just of sight. Even a classical notion such as that of the influence exerted by a past master is really a matter of sharing a momentary vision. To perceive the work already out there is to become implicated in a point of view that does not belong to the author but to a possible world in the making.
That's a lot like what T.S. Eliot argued in that one essay. Something about like the individual and artistic, it was some pretentious title, but he was arguing that during an art movement, when somebody creates something that ends up being ascribed to it, it's not that they're the ones contributing to the movement, it's the movement already was put in place before that person even got there. And you can extrapolate that idea in the Committee to Abolish Outer Space. The whole reason we're already embracing all these ideas of colonization elsewhere, this perception this is all inevitable, is because of that same thing. And this idea is even being translated here. And as Deleuze concludes, the problem of art, the correlative problem of creation is a problem of perception and not memory. So the whole issue here is that we're just transposing all of our ideas of what we think is going to happen onto what's actually happening.
Reminds me of this image of a restoration that Jay posted the other day.
Yeah, or like even what we're doing with Notre Dame right now.
That idea too, that it's more about perception than memory. Recently I've been thinking of the Squeeze Case Eternal scene in Moby Dick with Ishmael. While squeezing whale spermaceti, he ends up squeezing another man's hand, and he has a fever dream where he imagines angels with their arms elbow deep in whale spermaceti. And I've been thinking of that scene as artistic creation that has philosophy tied to it. And to bring it back to this idea, there's no memory in that creation. It's not like Ishmael has a memory of meeting angels who are doing the labor of a whaler or anything like that. But there is also an interesting definition of remember that Professor Theo Harris brought up once, which is that when you remember, you're putting your parts back together, which is the etymological derivation of remember. Each of your members you are bringing back together when you remember. We got 3 pages left. The novelty of the conceptual or non-finito state of such works of Michelangelo's as the Pitti Tondo or the Prisoners is not that their complete execution is no longer indispensable, as if they would still be completed by reference to a prefabricated idea. Soriel contrasts the instaurative journey to the existential incompleteness of things to the notion of the unfinished as a project, that is, to Eugene Delacroix's interpretation of Michelangelo's non finito, rather, what appears to be an imperfect union of form and matter, both to our natural perception and when compared to classicist art, is a sign of spiritual accomplishment that bestows a new sense on things. It is the idea itself that is incomplete, whereas the marble becomes saturated with a new perspective. This is how Vasari appreciates the perfect control of Michelangelo's hand in San Matteo. In its sketch state, it reveals the perfection to which it aspires and teaches all sculptors the maniera, in which one carves figures from stone without harm. The point of carving is that it articulates something that already exists in the block, something that, crucially, may never be entirely freed from its matrix. Whereas modeling is based on the projection of primary penmanship, in filing or chiseling the figure itself is only the medium for the material to come alive. As Adrian Stokes says of Agostino di Duccio, the true carver's power to draw is a secondary power, for it is inspired by his attitude to stone. Just real quick, there's a documentary about Charles Eames, and they mentioned that, I might have this a little mixed up, but it was something like his wife saw painting as an extension of architecture. It could be switched around, I don't remember, but that kind of relates here a little bit.
Furtive bas relief comes to mind. Sneaky paint sculpture.
That's like the way that Sajord describes Michelangelo's sculptures in possibly a different writing than this book is as serpentine. If you think about it like that, and you look at Michelangelo's David and even other ones too, they do have a very slender, serpentine, almost paint-like character to it. Anyway, even if carving is traditionally opposed to disegno, from the perspective of the creative act, their distinction is only a difference of degree. Do we not experience secondness in Michelangelo's many drawings, disegni, used as his studies for his paintings and sculptures? Every attempt stimulates a next one, such that the fragmented work can only be reconstructed serially. The idea is never fully present and does not exist outside the constantly rehearsed manner in which it is worked out and worked through. To have an aesthetic vision means being immersed in this non-linear process of composition. To install, to build, to construct is not simply the gradual intensification of an initially weak existence. To create a work of thought is to give birth to 1,000 ideas and to submit them to relations, to proportions. It is to invent great dominant themes and to impose their control over the ideas, those monstrous rebels that need to be subdued time and again.
I've posted nearly all of the art pieces that I could find that were mentioned just in the last section. And the first three were Delatour, and he's painting the same period as Caravaggio. And you can see it's very Caravaggesque with the light source illuminating the characters. And then the next one is Giambologna's Alpine Colossus. These were like huge garden ornaments. They're amazing. And then the rest, Michelangelo, and the last one is the Saint. And the series of 4 statues is confused whether they're slaves or what they're trying to be. They're incomplete. Yeah, let me finish this off. In the aspiration to perfection, there is no pre-modeling and no finality, just metamorphosis. What we have called intuitions are not transcendent ideas, but immanent feedback and feed-forward loops. They are not the product of our thought, but what make us think. They depend on sensitive and sensory evaluations that pose more problems than they solve, as they demand the very invention of what they are about. Making is thinking and seeing, and what I cannot create, I do not know. We discover this autonomy of the work, unfinished in principle rather than in fact, in the hallucinatory yet efficient quality of Mannerist figures. Every experience of the possible is hallucinatory to the extent that it is creative while still being part of the past. If there is an optical resemblance between the strained postures of Michelangelo's figures on the one hand and natural images on the other, this is no longer performed by a model, past or present, that is then deformed by some temporal gap, but the futural effect of a repetition of plastic forces. It is an absolutely new merging of past and future. Wiley Cypher describes it well when he situates Michelangelo's sculptural technique between Donatello's method of cutting away from the block and Bernini's expanding of volumes around an armature that is already in place. The paradox of Michelangelo's statuary is that the vigorous carving creates, strangely, an effect of modeled volumes. Never full-born, always monstrous. Between carving and modeling, we can only follow the inner vitality of the work as it struggles out of its adamantine block through the unmolded shapes of foreign durations that resist completion. The unfinishedness of dominant themes is inseparable from their infinitization in perception, where matter and manner meld. Perhaps the ultimate implication of a truly Mannerist spirituality is this paradox of a Neoplatonist overturning of Platonism based not on resemblances, but on manners of resembling. Artistic ideas are neither Platonic ideas nor Aristotelian essences, but entirely operative thoughts that remain coextensive to and undergo qualitative transformations with the materials in which they are expressed. Becoming is more than an imitation, not less. Before resemblance becomes representational, it is what we have called an analogical expression, a resemblance produced with accidental and non-resembling means. Instead of an economy of originals imitable in space, we discover a dynamic of imminent deviation that subsumes all content and renders the work of art a monument of time itself. Such a work is the work of the artist par excellence, the forger, for it is with the forger that the critical form of the true gives way to the powers of the false. To have an idea is to be done with judgment and to manipulate forces, nothing but forces. Those relations of time which Deleuze also calls the powers of the future. Unlike form, force has no stable essence. It has no what, but only a who, a how, and a that. This has two further important implications. First, the disconnection between the stages of conception and execution, or force and resistance, is not at all a Mannerist idea, but precisely a classical one. It is precisely non-artistic signs that transcend their development insofar as they retain a natural, subjective or objective signification, whereas in art, the signs stay fully immanent to the style of their development. Matter, manner, and idea are not three successive movements in an evolution, but three modes participating in each work. Sometimes it proceeds from the heart, sometimes it proceeds from the hand, sometimes it proceeds from the head. Mannerism makes these genetic moments simultaneously and remixes them in a transformed way of seeing things that is irreducible to any one of them taken separately. The work of art is artistic in the degree in which the two functions of transformation, conception and execution, are affected by a single operation. Why do we do what we do? There are causes and there are ends, but more fundamental is the way in which we do things. As Bergson puts it, the what is always more abstract than the how, the rhythm, course, or fluence, while still incorporating causes and ends. In doing something well, the cause, the end, and the way coincide. Here, there is no aim for perfection, since in its constant dealing with obstacles, the work could never take form in a purified state. Indeed, reflecting Bellori's late Mannerist equation of manner and fantastic idea, insofar as the idea is the object of a practice that exceeds mere mimesis, la maniera o vogliamo dire fantastica idea appoggiata alla pratica e non all'imitazione. Art is based on the perfect unity of idea and style, the latter being the formal unity of composition of a work insofar as it does not refer to anything else. Second, this approximation of idea and matter means that art and craft can no longer be neatly distinguished. An idea, prescription, motor schema, digital code, or genetic script can inform matter, but at the same time they are tested and transformed by their material's opaque residues. The applied arts constitute an implied art, always already germinating and assiduously actualizing relations between objects, for example, of proportion or beauty, that are not predetermined by their current function. Although it takes a continual practical effort to develop and sustain an intuition, this development is purely a matter of cultivation as opposed to a method. And it is speculative, since it is a risky matter of stubborn perseverance and self-certainty about what one wants to do without knowing how to get there. This is why contemporary designers and theorists like to compare their work to applied arts, such as cooking or gardening or growing a beard. In both art and nature, things come into existence by variation, internal movement, and distributed agency. Instead of the realization of an original, there is only transduction, a transmission constantly falling out of phase with itself. Design becomes a matter of skill and sentience, of learning to pay attention to and experiment and collaborate with materials which present themselves as riddles, as clusters of tendencies one first needs to learn how to read.
I really like these references to metamorphosis. In the aspiration to perfection, there is no finality, just metamorphosis. And what I appreciate about that is it's this constant idea of how nowadays in the age of the internet, we all struggle to think we could ever create something original. And this burden for making something not just good, but unique enough. It's been a big psychic boundary for a lot of people. And then especially as well, it's been redoubled with the pervasiveness of large language models who can pump out text that is very credible. For writers, that's quite endangering, and in all sorts of creative aspects, it's quite limiting. But this idea that there is still imminent feedback loops or intuitions that you can... I had more of a thought whilst we were reading. I'm sorry, I got lost myself.
When it mentioned the forger, I thought you might have some stuff to say on that because of our November 10th reading when you were talking about how if you're an art imitator that's going to paint the Mona Lisa, you have to be an incredibly skilled painter to pass it off. And there was this quote here: "Such a work is the work of the artist par excellence, the forger. For it is with the forger that the critical form of the true gives way to the powers of the false." And even Jay's, also the November 10th,
Yeah, that made me
counterfeit.
think of that as well. That the original word for painting was counterfeit. So painting is literally a forgery of life.
And also, I started thinking about the etymological derivation of painting as counterfeit, and how nowadays we use counterfeit to usually refer to money and not paintings. And if you think about it, the way that a lot of people will talk about money or the economy is like it's a natural force. And there's a great South Park episode on this. We have angered the mighty economy by spending too much. But in reality, the economy and money is a social construction. But using this derivation of counterfeit, we can say that money is a counterfeit of nature, and so a counterfeit dollar is a counterfeit of a counterfeit.
You're on the right track with that notion, but also there's things that I've been bouncing around with you guys for years. Yes, money in the economy is a thing that we have given birth to, that we've created. And with the same line of thinking, yes, we come to the same conclusion that you're talking about as a counterfeit of a counterfeit. And at the same time, the economy is still very real because we all engage with this as if it's real. And so even if we all come to this realization that it's a counterfeit, or that it's this false thing, or that it's natural or unnatural or whatever, or an unnatural natural thing, it still has a very real effect. It still has very real impact. So that's one of the things that always bothers me, because so many Marxist takes bank on Rousseauian notions, like we artificially divided these things and therefore X, Y, and Z. And that's a good way to talk about this in theory, but what you're talking about, this counterfeit or counterfeit, it ties back into the whole notion of families. Why did the first family put up the first wall? What was the point of it? And Rousseau would have us think the whole point was they were basically making property. But what if they weren't? Because the first crops, first cereals, they were planted for fun. It was because they liked the way they looked and they wanted more toys. We can't really balance this notion that this first major investment in agriculture that so many people, including many Marxists, pin on the downfall and the turn of society that led to this specialization and bureaucratization. But we know that's actually not really how it happened. So there's this balance between natural and counterfeit, or original and counterfeit. And the original things are arising from the family, and they're being counteracted by the social forces and cultural forces and economic forces. All of these unnatural things are responding to the natural byproducts. So this notion that we're talking about here with this counterfeit of a counterfeit, in order to get back or to get to the third step of what Jay was talking about with his 3-step thing, we have to embrace the economy. And this is ironically enough what Land was talking about when he talked about Deleuze, dark Deleuze, and the whole notion of accelerationism and how he considered Marx himself an accelerationist. Because if the way to get capitalism to break is to further the inherent contradictions when I'm a capitalist or whatever he said, it's interesting to see a lot of these thinkers move in these mannerist ways, even though they were analyzing these things in materialist or realist ways.
That's the fatalist view, isn't it?
It's a very fatalist view. It's actually more of a paternalistic view.
I'm not really so much of the thought that because something is socially constructed, we can ignore it, or saying that it's socially constructed, now we've done away with the problem.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying you were, but I've met a lot of people that do that.
I would say that they would be more properly defined as leftists than Marxists, and probably baby leftists at that too, because
I don't know, because I had some professors in grad school who were Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, and they were just like, they had that notion that the economy is this thing that we made up and we can move on from it. And it's like you're saying, it's like baby's first leftism. But even so, there's people in positions of power who are ostensibly associated with these revolutionary movements or who had done things with them. I know a few people in particular who I used to work with who were older and who ended up retiring before I left academia, who had been part of revolutionary movements in China, in Vietnam, and they were ousted and enemies of their country for a little while. One of them was a Canadian professor from Quebec, and he actually took shelter in China to get away from some of the persecution he faced from things he did in Vietnam. But my point is, some of these people were still promoting these ideas and they were involved in the front lines. So my point is this counterfeit and the counterfeit of a counterfeit. My point is more that there's a balance here, and so many people are trying to go one side or the other.
That was more so just to have a little bit of fun with the derivation of counterfeit.
I get what you're talking about, but you see
the
what
counterfeit
I'm
dollar
sorry,
is doubly counterfeit.
But is Bitcoin a counterfeit of real money?
It's true. All the money, the latest, the new.
We're getting into I'm 14 in this deep territory.
But
like
at
the same time, this mannerist discussion would be like, you know what? You are 14, and yeah, it is fucking deep. Because really, why aren't we doing things differently, especially when we can? And I would argue we're not doing things differently because lots of people are, for lack of a better term, possessed.